What if a united America collapsed in the 18th century? It's oftentimes surprised me that a country that is now 3 times the size of the Roman Empire has survived nearly 300 years with only one major secessionist movement. And an interesting alternate history to ask would be, what if the U.S. was divided? What if the U.S. collapsed as a united entity when it was its weakest in the late 18th century after the Revolution? For those of you who are not students of American history, it might come as a surprise that in the late 18th century there was a real possibility that the country could split apart into different states. And this actually could have happened very easily, since the states held a great amount of power, much more than the federal government. Each state had their own militia, currency, and many of their own laws, and even some states tried to create tariffs with interstate trade. And so, it's not unreasonable to think the country could have just split up. The sheer size of America is also an issue, and points towards disunity. The eastern seaboard of America is larger than most European nations, and it's north-south, meaning there are greater climatic differences, with the deep south being almost entirely agricultural, while New England being maritime, and each of these regions would want something different out of the government, and would tear the Union apart. Although there are many ways to start this timeline, I'm going to start with all the Founding Fathers dying in a fire and being replaced by hopelessly mediocre rulers who would be unable to deal with the challenges of starting the new nation. The Whiskey Rebellion, Shays' Rebellion, whether or not to keep the Articles of Confederation, the role of government, slavery, how to pay off the debts from the Revolution, and so many more problems plagued the young republic. And so it's not hard to believe that with any worse leadership, the states wouldn't have simply said screw it and left the Union. And that's what happens in this timeline. The ineffectual government is unable to solve the state's issues, and the state stop seeing the point in the Philadelphia/Washington government, depending on the timing, and they start to break off. And with state militias sometimes being more powerful than the federal government's army, it's not hard to imagine states simply just forgetting about the centralized government and leaving. The countries would originally look something like this, generally breaking out along old state boundaries, with the exception of a few incidences. The Deep South would ally in a single confederation because in this time period they felt a general unity against the rest of the states. A similar thing would also happen to New England, which is probably the most culturally unified part of the country, as well as Pennsylvania would conquer Delaware, because until the American Revolution, Delaware actually wasn't an independent state, it was a protectorate of Pennsylvania, and if the country fell apart, this old situation would likely reappear. Vermont might initially declare independence, but the thing is, Vermont is just simply so poor that at one point integration into the rest of New England would have had to have happened. I'm sure some of the history buffs who are watching this have seen this map before, and I'm going to talk briefly about it, because if I don't, I know I'm going to get some angry comments for neglecting it. But there was an awkward time in the late 18th century in our timeline in which the U.S. government didn't really know what to do with the Midwestern and deep Southern territories, to give them to the East Coast states or to create new states with them. And this is a map showing the territorial claims each state had over the Midwestern and Southern territories. As you have probably figured out, this map is not an accurate representation of how the territory grab in the Midwest and Deep South would have happened, mainly because most of the states doing the claims wouldn't have had the military or the geographic power to solidify those claims. For example, a lot of the claims in the upper Midwest were from New England states, which would have been blocked by at least 2 other states, which would have been more powerful from achieving those claims, and there's no way New York could have controlled the entire Midwest, since it was blocked by the much more wealthy and populated state of Pennsylvania in that time period. A more plausible division of the West likely would have happened along these lines, with Virginia and Pennsylvania, the 2 most powerful and populous states, taking up the Midwest, while the Deep South takes the southern part of the Western territories. No one of these nations would be powerful enough to buy all Louisiana territory, and so it would remain in French hands until it would be conquered by Britain in the Napoleonic Wars. This would terrify the Deep South, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, which would feel that this was constricting their strength and they were being encircled by Britain, and so they would form a pact to take the Louisiana territory from Britain. Britain would not be willing to sell the Louisiana territory, since it would be worried that if it did, the American nations would get too powerful and would start competing with Britain and threaten Britain's preeminence on the continent. This would lead to war with the coalition forces attacking into the Louisiana territory and Pennsylvanians attacking into Canada. Meanwhile, New York and New England would remain neutral because they would want to maintain trade links with both blocs. The invasion of Canada would be a failure just like our timeline, but Louisiana would be seized fairly easily due to its lightly defended nature. The British would not be happy with the American seizure of Louisiana, and so, after winning the war against Napoleon, they would have sent their armies west to the Americas to defeat the Americans there. And this would have attacked in two routes, the first being at the Chesapeake to wipe out Pennsylvania and Virginia, and the second being at the mouth of the Mississippi to take back the Louisiana Territory and control the Mississippi, thus controlling the Ohio River Valley and much of the Deep South's trade. This was actually Britain's original plan in our world, but it never happened for three reasons. The first being that the British population was war-weary after fighting Napoleon for 20 years. Second is the British people didn't really hate the Americans that much. And the third was that Wellington didn't want to do it. And so the British would be losing their best general in the war. Just like in our world, the British would have lost the Battle of New Orleans, and the Mississippi offensive would have ground to a halt. The Chesapeake front would be more of a mixed bag, because the British would be able to win the battles, but they never would be able to fully crush the Americans and dominate on them. I honestly think that the Virginians, Southerners, and Pennsylvanians would win the war, mainly because Britain had already been fighting Napoleon for 20 years, and was war-weary, and also the British population didn't really care that much about reconquering the Louisiana Territory and subduing the Americans. They thought of more as cousins due to the cultural similarities. Also, the territories we're talking about are so large that it would be impossible for a British army of any realistic size to fully subdue them. And so, after a tired slogfest, the Americans would finally come out victorious. The Louisiana Territory likely be divided something along these lines, in which Pennsylvania took the northern half, Virginia took the middle, and the Deep South took the southern part. As Pennsylvania, Virginia, and the Deep South would get more powerful due to territorial acquisitions in the West, it would mean the nations back in the East would start to lose their regional power. For example, Maryland and New Jersey would flat out be annexed by Virginia and Pennsylvania respectively, or would openly join for the greater trade links. Also, areas like New England and New York would start to lose their status as local and continental powers. Just like in our timeline, the Mexicans would still invite southern settlers into Texas to help put down the Comanche, and just like in our timeline, these southern settlers would still get angry at the Mexican government and rebel. Just like in our timeline, the Americans back home would want to help out the Texan rebels, and so the Deep South would declare war on Mexico to help the Texan rebels, and also to gain Mexican territory, since the Deep South was the country that got the least out of the Louisiana War. Since the Mexican-American War was a pretty lopsided war, we can assume that even without the help of the rest of the country, the Deep South still would have been able to defeat Mexico and win the war. In our timeline, many Southerners wanted to annex more of northern Mexico, but the Northerners were not okay with this, because it would mean that there would be many more slave states, and that would outbalance the amount of free states. But in a nation run completely by Southerners, it would mean that the Deep South would annex the other top third of Mexico in this timeline. To be continued in part 2. If you like this video, please comment or subscribe. Whatifalthist. Thank you for watching.